horror in the icy mountains. You will hear in this video, a routine flight turns into a nightmare when the plane crashes in the mountains. The main character meets Eliza just before the disaster, and they find themselves among the few survivors. As days pass, their situation worsens. Cold, hunger, and fear take over. With no rescue in sight, desperation pushes the group to the edge, leading to cannibalism. Eliza and the hero try to stay sane as others give in to madness. When the survivors start hunting each other, the two must escape into the treacherous mountains. It's a fight for survival where the real threat isn't just the wild, but what people become when all hope is lost. Part 1. Getting to know Eliza. They say planes are the safest way to travel, but I never believed them. Not really. As I fastened my seatbelt and settled into my seat, the hum of the engines below sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd flown, but something about this flight felt different. Like a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times. The seat next to me was still empty, and I found myself hoping it would stay that way. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. My nerves were shot already, and the thought of making forced conversation with a stranger made my skin crawl. But, as if on cue, she appeared. She was the kind of person who walked with purpose, her presence almost too big for the narrow aisle of the plane. A mess of dark hair fell around her shoulders, and her eyes, sharp and restless, locked onto me as she approached. She smiled, an easy, natural smile that made me think of someone used to putting people at ease. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice low and steady. I shook my head, forcing a smile in return. "All yours." She slid into the seat beside me, her movements fluid and confident. I noticed the small details, how she buckled her seatbelt with an air of practiced nonchalance, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest as if she were playing an invisible piano. "First time flying?" she asked, turning to face me. I hesitated. "No, but I never really get used to it." She chuckled softly, a sound that seemed out of place in the sterile, artificial environment of the plane. "Same here. But it's better than the alternatives, right?" I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. Something about her presence was oddly comforting, despite my initial reluctance. We fell into an easy conversation, the kind that happens when two strangers meet with no expectations, no baggage. Her name was Eliza, and she was flying out for a job interview, something in the tech world, though she brushed off the details with a wave of her hand. "And you?" she asked after a while, tilting her head slightly. "What's your story?" It was a simple question, but for some reason, it caught me off guard. My story? I wasn't sure I had one worth telling, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet curiosity that made me want to open up. "I'm heading home," I said finally, the words coming out slower than I intended. "Family stuff. It's complicated." Eliza didn't pry, just nodded as if she understood. We talked about lighter things after that. Music, movies, the kind of small talk that fills the gaps in a conversation. But there was an undercurrent to our words, a shared tension that neither of us acknowledged. Maybe it was the turbulence that started to shake the plane gently, or maybe it was something more primal, a sense that the world outside our little bubble was closing in. The plane jolted suddenly, and my heart leapt into my throat. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and a voice crackled over the intercom, telling us to stay seated. Eliza glanced at me, her eyes sharp and alert. "This feels worse than usual," I muttered, gripping the armrest tighter. Eliza nodded, her fingers tightening around her own armrest. "Yeah, it does." For a moment, the plane was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rattle and groan of the metal around us. The lights flickered, and I caught the briefest glimpse of fear in Eliza's eyes before she masked it with a determined smile. "We'll be fine," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the false sense of security that came from pretending everything was okay. But the plane jolted again, more violently this time, and the overhead bins rattled ominously. The fear that had been simmering in the back of my mind started to bubble over, and I could see it reflected in the faces of the other passengers. Then it happened. A sound like metal tearing apart, a scream that wasn't entirely human. The plane lurched to one side, and suddenly, everything was wrong. The lights went out completely, plunging us into a darkness that was only broken by the flashes of lightning outside the windows. Eliza's hand found mine in the chaos, her grip tight and unyielding. "Hold on!" she shouted, though her voice was nearly drowned out by the cacophony around us. I held on. To her hand, to the armrest, to the fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, we would make it through this. But deep down, I knew better. The plane was falling, and so were we. Part 2. Turbulence and Catastrophe. The plane was a living nightmare. We were falling, and the world had become a cacophony of screams, metal grinding against metal, and the unrelenting roar of the wind outside. My ears were ringing, and the pressure in the cabin had dropped so suddenly that I felt like my lungs were being squeezed by an invisible hand. Eliza's hand was still clutched in mine, her knuckles white. I wanted to say something, anything to break the terror that had settled over us. But words failed me. My throat was dry, and every breath felt like dragging air through sandpaper. The plane lurched again, and we were thrown against our seatbelts. I heard the unmistakable sound of a metal joint snapping somewhere behind us, followed by a gut-wrenching tear as the fuselage started to peel away. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of burning fuel and the metallic tang of blood. In the brief flashes of lightning outside, I could see the horror on the faces of the passengers around us. Eyes wide with fear, mouths open in silent screams. The world outside the windows was a chaotic blur of darkness and light, and the ground was rushing up to meet us at an impossible speed. The impact was inevitable. I felt it in my bones before it happened, a sickening anticipation that churned in my gut. Time seemed to slow as the plane plunged into the mountainside, the jagged peaks looming like the teeth of some monstrous beast ready to devour us whole. The first impact was deafening. The plane slammed into the rocky slope with a force that sent everything flying, luggage, debris, bodies. The cabin twisted and buckled, and I was thrown forward, my seatbelt the only thing keeping me from being ejected like a rag doll. Eliza's hand slipped from mine in the chaos, and I heard her scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the noise like a knife. We hit again and again. Each time the plane crumpled further, the metal skin tearing apart like paper. Sparks flew as the wings sheared off, the engines exploding into flames that illuminated the wreckage with a hellish glow. The plane was no longer a plane. It was a crumpled tin can tumbling down the mountainside, scattering its contents like toys spilled from a box. When we finally came to a stop, everything was silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears, too loud to be comforting. For a moment I thought I was dead. The world was still, and I was floating in a haze of pain and confusion. But then the reality of it hit me, and the silence shattered. I gasped for air, the sharp intake of breath sending a jolt of pain through my chest. My body felt like it had been beaten with a sledgehammer. Every bone ached, every muscle screamed in protest as I tried to move. The seatbelt dug into my ribs, and it took every ounce of strength I had left to reach up and unclip it. I fell forward, collapsing onto the floor of the cabin. The metal was cold against my cheek, and the smell of smoke and blood was overwhelming. I coughed, the action racking my body with pain, and forced myself to look around. The cabin was a twisted, smoking ruin. Seats had been ripped from their moorings, bodies strewn about like broken dolls. Some were still moving, groaning in pain, while others lay unnaturally still, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting the scene in a sickly, uneven glow. "Eliza!" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. My throat was raw, every word a struggle. "Eliza, where are you?" I tried to stand, but my legs gave out beneath me, and I slumped back to the floor. Panic started to set in as I crawled forward, dragging myself through the debris. The plane had broken apart, sections of the fuselage torn away to reveal the jagged rocks and snow outside. The wind howled through the openings, bringing with it the bitter cold of the mountains. "Eliza!" I shouted, louder this time, but the only response was the groaning of the twisted metal around me. I felt a surge of desperation, the need to find her driving me forward. My hands were numb and bloodied from crawling over shattered glass and twisted metal, but I didn't care. I had to find her. I had to know if she was still alive. Finally, I saw her. A dark shape slumped against the wall of the cabin, half buried under a collapsed seat. My heart skipped a beat, and I scrambled toward her, my vision blurring as tears welled up in my eyes. "Eliza," I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She didn't respond, didn't move. For a moment, I feared the worst, but then I saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but barely. "Hang on," I muttered, more to myself than to her. I had to get her out of here, away from the wreckage before it went up in flames. The smell of fuel was thick in the air, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the fire reached us. With a strength I didn't know I had left, I started to pull the seat off of her. It was heavy, but adrenaline and fear fueled me, and I managed to free her from the wreckage. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, but she was breathing. That was enough for now. I slipped my arms under her shoulders, dragging her toward the opening in the fuselage. The cold hit me like a wall as we emerged into the open air, the wind whipping around us with a ferocity that stung my exposed skin. The snow was deep, and I stumbled as I tried to find solid ground beneath my feet. We were on the side of a mountain, the wreckage of the plane scattered across the slope like a trail of breadcrumbs. The night sky was a churning mass of storm clouds, the peaks around us looming like shadowy sentinels. There was no sign of help, no sign of civilization, just the endless expanse of wilderness stretching out in every direction. I laid Eliza down in the snow, gently cradling her head. Her face was smeared with blood, and there was a gash on her forehead that was still oozing. I tore a piece of fabric from my shirt, pressing it against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Come on, Eliza," I whispered, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "You have to wake up. I can't do this alone." As if hearing my plea, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared up at me, her expression dazed and confused. Then the pain hit, and she gasped, her body tensing as she tried to sit up. "Don't move," I said quickly, pushing her back down. "You're hurt. Just stay still." She blinked, her eyes focusing on me, and I saw the fear in them, the same fear that was gnawing at my insides. What happened?" "We crashed," I said, my voice shaking. "The plane, it went down. We're in the mountains somewhere, I don't know where." She groaned, her hand going to her head. "I feel like I've been hit by a truck." "You and me both," I muttered, glancing around. We needed to find shelter, someplace to get out of the cold. The wind was picking up, and the snow was starting to fall heavier, the flakes sticking to our clothes and hair. There was a part of the plane's fuselage still relatively intact a few meters away, and I figured it was our best bet for now. It would at least provide some protection from the elements until I could figure out our next move. "Can you walk?" I asked, helping her to her feet. She swayed unsteadily, leaning heavily on me for support. "I think so," she said, though her voice was weak, "but I don't know how far." "It's not far," I reassured her, though I wasn't sure of that myself. Every step felt like a marathon, my legs barely holding up under the strain. But we made it, collapsing inside the shelter of the fuselage with a collective sigh of relief. The interior was cold and dark, but at least we were out of the wind. I could still hear the creaks and groans of the plane settling, and the occasional crackle of something burning in the distance. But for now, we were safe. I turned to Eliza, who was shivering despite the blankets I'd managed to scavenge from the wreckage. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. We needed warmth, food, and a plan, none of which I had. "We'll get through this," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "We just have to hold on until help comes." But as the minutes turned to hours and the storm outside intensified, the realization began to sink in. We were alone, stranded in the mountains with no way to call for help. and no idea if anyone even knew we were still alive. And as the first night wore on, the cold creeping into our bones, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of our ordeal. Part 3. First shock and realization. The cacophony of the crash was a chaotic blur, screeching metal, shattering glass, and the relentless howling of the wind. I remember the moment the plane's impact sent us sprawling, the seatbelts tearing into my skin, the world around me a violent storm of sound and motion. When the chaos subsided, there was a disorienting silence, punctuated only by the faint hiss of escaping air and the distant rumble of the storm. My mind struggled to grasp reality as I lay amidst the wreckage. Pain radiated through my body, but I forced myself to focus. I found Eliza lying nearby, her face pale and her breath shallow. Panic surged through me as I crawled over to her, the cold biting at my exposed skin. I checked her pulse and felt a wave of relief when I found it weak but steady. "Eliza," I said, shaking her gently. "Eliza, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear evident. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "What happened?" "We crashed," I said, trying to keep my tone steady despite the dread clawing at my insides. "We need to get out of here. Can you move?" She nodded weakly, struggling to sit up. I helped her, wrapping my jacket around her as best as I could. The storm outside was a relentless assault of snow and wind, the once familiar world now a frozen wasteland. I scanned the wreckage, my heart sinking as I saw the extent of the damage. The fuselage was a twisted, burning skeleton, and the plane's wings were shattered, lying in the snow like broken appendages. The cabin was littered with debris, scattered luggage, broken seats, and the remnants of our former lives. We had to find a way out. I led Eliza towards the exit, our progress slow and labored. The cold was oppressive, the wind biting through our clothes, and every step felt like wading through a thick, icy sludge. We made our way through the wreckage, our movements clumsy and uncertain. As we emerged from the shattered fuselage, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The plane had crashed into a steep mountainside, the wreckage scattered across the snow-covered ground. The landscape was a disorienting maze of white and gray, the storm creating a blizzard that obscured everything beyond a few feet. I glanced back at the plane, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. We were alone, stranded in the mountains with no visible sign of help. The storm was fierce, the wind howling through the wreckage and the snow swirling around us in a blinding haze. "Eliza, we need to find shelter," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We can't stay here. We're exposed." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I helped her through the snow, our steps leaving deep impressions in the powder. The cold was relentless, seeping into our bones and making it hard to think straight. I tried to stay focused, scanning the area for any sign of a safer place. We spotted a small rise in the terrain, a cluster of jagged rocks partially hidden by the snow. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I guided Eliza towards it, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. We huddled together behind the rocks, the wind howling around us and the snow piling up in drifts. The cave-like shelter offered some protection from the storm, though it was far from comfortable. The cold was still biting, and the snow continued to fall heavily, creating a thick, oppressive layer. I tried to make Eliza as comfortable as possible, using what little gear we had to shield her from the worst of the elements. I searched through the wreckage, looking for anything that could help us. I found a first aid kit, a few bottles of water, and some snacks, but there was little else. The wreckage was scattered and chaotic, and it was hard to tell what might be useful. When I returned to our makeshift shelter, Eliza was shivering uncontrollably, her face pale and drawn. I did my best to warm her, wrapping her in every piece of fabric I could find. I tried to keep her calm, though my own fear was nearly overwhelming. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice more a plea than a promise. "Someone will find us." But as the hours passed, the harsh reality of our situation began to sink in. We were isolated, the storm making it impossible for any potential rescuers to reach us. The cold was unforgiving, and our chances of survival seemed slim. The wind outside was relentless, the howling sound a constant reminder of how precarious our situation was. Every now and then, I heard the distant rumble of thunder, the storm adding another layer of fear and uncertainty. I kept watch through the night, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The growls I had heard earlier were now a distant memory, but the fear of what might be lurking out there was still with me. The cave was our temporary refuge, but it wasn't a solution. I glanced at Eliza, her eyes closed as she tried to rest. I knew we couldn't stay here forever. We needed to find a way to signal for help, to escape this nightmare before it was too late. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the storm, I knew that we had to make a decision. We couldn't wait for help that might never come. We had to take action, find a way to survive, and hope against hope that someone, somewhere, would come looking for us. Part 4. Storm and Threat. The growls outside grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was closing in on us. Eliza's eyes widened in fear, and she struggled to sit up, her strength failing her. I could see the terror in her gaze, the helplessness that mirrored my own. "We need to get out of here," I urged, helping her to her feet. Her body swayed with the effort, and she clung to me, her grip weak but desperate. I wrapped an arm around her, trying to support her weight as I glanced around for anything that could be used as a weapon or a shield. The wind had picked up again, howling through the broken windows of the fuselage and sending a shiver down my spine. Snow was blowing in, drifting over the floor and creating a cold, oppressive layer. I could see my breath fogging the air, the icy chill seeping into my bones. I had to get us somewhere safer, away from the wreckage and whatever was stalking us. The mountain terrain was treacherous, but we had no choice. I helped Eliza towards the exit, taking one last look at the interior of the fuselage. It was a chaotic mess of twisted metal and scattered debris, a stark reminder of how precarious our situation was. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall again, the wind driving it horizontally and making it difficult to see. The growls were now accompanied by heavy thuds, as if something large and powerful was moving through the snow. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. We stumbled through the snow, our progress slow and labored. Every step felt like a battle, the snow dragging at our legs and the cold biting through our clothes. Eliza's breathing was labored, and I could feel her trembling against me, her strength fading with each step. The growls were getting closer, and I could hear the sound of something crashing through the underbrush, the crunch of snow and the snapping of branches. I glanced back, my heart pounding in my chest, but all I could see was a wall of white, the snow obscuring everything beyond a few feet. We reached a small rise in the terrain, a cluster of jagged rocks that might provide some cover. I guided Eliza towards it, helping her to sit down as I scanned the area. The rocks were cold and rough, but they offered some protection from the wind and the snow. "Stay here," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll see if I can find out what's out there." Eliza nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Be careful," she managed to say, her voice trembling. I moved carefully, trying to stay low and out of sight. The growls were now almost deafening, echoing off the mountainsides and making it hard to think. I crept forward, using the rocks and trees as cover, my senses on high alert. As I made my way through the snow, I spotted a dark shape moving in the distance. It was large and fast, moving with an unnatural grace through the snow. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that it was no ordinary animal. It was something bigger, more menacing. I ducked behind a tree, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I watched the shape move closer. It was a creature of nightmares, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The growls were coming from its throat, a low, rumbling sound that sent chills down my spine. I had to get back to Eliza, had to warn her before it was too late. I turned and made my way back to the rocks, my movements quick and urgent. The creature was still moving closer, its growls growing louder with each passing moment. When I reached Eliza, she was huddled against the rocks, her eyes wide and scared. I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice steady as I spoke. "We need to move again," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There's something out there. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous." Eliza nodded, her fear palpable. "Where do we go?" "I don't know," I admitted, glancing around for any sign of a safer place. We just need to keep moving, find somewhere to hide until we can figure out what to do. We stood up, our movements stiff and slow. The growls were getting closer, the sound of the creature crashing through the snow echoing through the mountains. I glanced back one last time, but the creature was still hidden in the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance. We moved carefully through the snow, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan. The storm was picking up again, the wind driving the snow into our faces and making it hard to see. I could hear the creature's growls growing louder, more insistent, and I knew we didn't have much time. I spotted a small cave nestled among the rocks, partially hidden by the snow. It was our best chance for shelter, so I guided Eliza towards it, my heart pounding with fear and urgency. We crawled into the cave, the darkness enveloping us as we huddled together, trying to catch our breath. The cave was small and damp, but it offered some protection from the wind and the snow. I could hear the growls outside, the sound growing fainter as the creature moved away. For a moment, we were safe, but the fear and the cold were still with us. I sat down beside Eliza, my body shaking with the cold and the adrenaline. She was still shivering, her eyes closed as she tried to stay warm. I reached into my pack and pulled out the snacks I had scavenged, handing them to her. "Eat," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It'll help you stay warm." She took the food with shaking hands, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, trying to reassure her. "We'll get through this," I said, though my words felt hollow. The reality of our situation was beginning to sink in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling through the mountains and the snow falling heavily. The growls had faded away, but the fear of what might be lurking out there was still with me. As the night wore on, I kept watch, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The cave was a small refuge, but it was only a temporary solution. We needed to find a way to signal for help, to find a way out of this nightmare. But for now, all we could do was wait and hope that someone, somewhere, would come looking for us before it was too late. Part 5. Finding Help. The storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. The wind howled around us, whipping snow into blinding drifts. Despite the relentless cold, we knew that staying put wasn't an option. Our shelter provided some respite from the storm, but it was far from a long-term solution. We needed to find help or food, something to give us a fighting chance. As dawn broke, the light offered a fleeting glimpse of the devastation around us. The wreckage of the plane was partially buried in snow, the once mighty fuselage now a twisted, broken monument to our misfortune. The icy wind carried a sense of urgency with it, and we knew we had to act quickly. I gathered a few of the essentials: a flashlight, some of the remaining food, and a blanket to keep us warm. Eliza, though still pale and weak, was determined to help. She wrapped herself in a coat, clutching a small shovel I had found among the wreckage. It was an attempt at solidarity, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if we get lost?" "We have to try," I said, forcing confidence into my voice. "Staying here isn't an option. We need to find help or something to sustain us." Eliza nodded, taking a deep breath as if summoning her resolve. We set out, our path marked by deep impressions in the snow. The wind howled, and the snow whipped around us, obscuring our vision. We moved cautiously, following the faint tracks we had made the day before. The mountain was unforgiving, its slopes steep and treacherous. Each step was a struggle through the snow, and the cold seeped into our bones. Every now and then, we would stop to catch our breath, huddling together for warmth. The surrounding forest was a ghostly landscape, the trees stripped bare and the branches sagging under the weight of the snow. The silence was eerie, broken only by the howling wind and the occasional crack of branches under the weight of the snow. After several hours of trudging through the snow, we reached a small clearing. It offered a brief respite from the storm, and I took the opportunity to assess our situation. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my muscles ached from the exertion. I scanned the area, hoping to spot any signs of a trail or potential help. The snow-covered ground offered little in the way of clues, and the storm continued to obscure our surroundings. "That clearing is the best we can manage for now," I said, trying to stay optimistic. "Let's take a short break and then keep moving." Eliza nodded, her exhaustion evident. We huddled together, trying to warm ourselves as best as we could. The wind was less intense in the clearing, but the cold was still biting. I offered her some of the remaining food, hoping it would provide a bit of energy. We rested for a while, but as the day wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The snow continued to fall, and the wind grew stronger. We knew we couldn't stay here for long. The cold was becoming unbearable, and our chances of survival would diminish with each passing hour. "We should keep moving," I said, my voice firm despite the growing fear in my chest. "We need to find shelter or a way to signal for help." Eliza agreed, and we set out again, our progress slow but determined. The storm seemed to grow fiercer, the snow swirling around us in thick, opaque sheets. The cold was numbing, making it difficult to think clearly. We made our way through the forest, navigating by instinct and the faint trail we had made. Each step was a battle, the snow dragging at our legs and the cold seeping into our bones. I could see Eliza's breath misting in front of her, and her steps were becoming increasingly labored. Hours passed, and the landscape remained bleak and unchanging. The storm showed no signs of easing, and our energy was waning. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but the realization that we would be stranded in the cold made me push forward. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, we stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. It was half buried in snow, its wooden walls weathered and worn. The sight of it was a beacon of hope in the relentless storm. I approached cautiously, pushing aside the snow to reveal the door. It creaked open with a groan, and we stepped inside, grateful for the shelter it provided. The interior was cold and musty, but it offered some protection from the storm. We made our way inside, the dim light filtering through the small windows. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a few old blankets and a small unused fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was a far cry from the brutal conditions outside. Eliza slumped onto a makeshift bed, her exhaustion evident. I gathered some wood from the small pile outside and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was slow to build, but it was a welcome relief from the freezing cold. As the fire crackled to life, I could see the weariness in Eliza's eyes. We were safe for now, but the storm was still raging outside, and our situation remained precarious. We needed to conserve our energy and resources and hope that someone would find us soon. The storm howled outside, a constant reminder of the harsh reality we faced. We huddled together, the fire providing a small but vital source of warmth. As the night settled in, we tried to rest, knowing that the fight for survival was far from over. Part 6. Despair and the First Deaths. The cabin provided temporary refuge from the storm, but its comfort was fleeting. The cold outside was relentless, and the darkness seemed to press in on us, a constant reminder of our dire situation. We had managed to start a fire, but its warmth was only a small solace against the icy grip of the storm. Eliza and I spent the night huddled together, trying to conserve what little warmth we had. We took turns keeping watch, the eerie silence outside occasionally broken by the howl of the wind or the creak of the cabin's old wooden frame. Our thoughts were consumed by the fear of what might come next, and sleep was a distant luxury. The following morning brought no relief. The storm continued unabated, snow piling up against the cabin walls. We were cut off from the world, isolated in a snowbound wilderness. The dwindling supplies in our packs were a grim reminder of our precarious situation. As the days wore on, our situation grew increasingly desperate. We rationed our food and tried to stay warm, but the cold was unrelenting and our supplies were running dangerously low. The cabin, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a prison. Our concerns were soon compounded by the grim reality of the injuries sustained in the crash. We were not alone in our suffering. The wreckage had claimed several lives, and among those who survived, many were critically injured. It wasn't long before the first deaths began to occur. One morning, I awoke to find Eliza's face pale and drawn. Her breathing was labored, and she seemed weaker than before. I checked her pulse, feeling a pang of dread as I realized that she was slipping. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the cold seemed to be taking its toll. Despair began to creep in, its icy fingers wrapping around my heart. The first death was a cruel reminder of our vulnerability. I found the body of a young woman who had been traveling with us, her life extinguished by the cold, and the injuries sustained in the crash. The sight was a harsh blow, a stark testament to the dangers we faced. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were not just struggling against the elements. We were witnessing the slow unraveling of our group. The injured were succumbing to their wounds, and the cold was claiming more lives each day. As the days passed, the deaths continued. Each loss was a heavy blow, the cabin growing quieter with each passing hour. The atmosphere was thick with grief and fear, and the stark reality of our situation was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Eliza, despite her own suffering, tried to stay strong. She offered what little comfort she could to the others, her kindness a small beacon of hope in the bleakness of our situation. But even her strength was wavering, her own body struggling against the harsh conditions. The remaining survivors grew increasingly desperate. The harsh reality of our situation led to whispered conversations and fearful glances. The cold and hunger were taking their toll, and the fear of what might come next was palpable. It was a grim, unspoken understanding that our situation was deteriorating rapidly. With each passing day, the cabin became a somber reminder of the fragility of life. The first deaths had sparked a growing sense of dread, a palpable fear that the worst was yet to come. The cold, the isolation, and the mounting death toll were all contributing to a pervasive sense of hopelessness. We tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the weight of our situation was overwhelming. The reality of our predicament was sinking in, and the knowledge that our survival was uncertain was a constant source of anxiety. The days were long and cold, and the nights were filled with the chilling fear of what might happen next. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a stark reminder of our isolation. We were cut off from the world, with no way of knowing if help was on the way. The storm continued to rage outside, a constant reminder of the unforgiving nature of our situation. In the midst of the growing despair, there was a sense of resignation. We were trapped, struggling to survive in an environment that seemed determined to take everything from us. The deaths had cast a shadow over the cabin, and the cold was a constant reminder of how fragile our situation was. Eliza and I clung to each other for support, our shared fear and desperation a small comfort in the face of overwhelming odds. We knew that we had to keep going, to fight for survival despite the mounting challenges. But as the days continued to pass, and the cold grew more relentless, it became increasingly difficult to hold on to hope. Part 7. Running out of supplies and the first signs of cannibalism. The days blurred together in a grim routine. The cabin's meager supplies were dwindling rapidly, and our situation had become increasingly dire. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the relentless cold gnawed at us, a constant reminder of our vulnerability. With each passing day, the reality of our situation grew more severe. The food supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing, and the remaining rationed portions were barely enough to sustain us. The cold was unrelenting, seeping into our bones and making even the simplest tasks a struggle. Eliza's condition continued to worsen. Despite my efforts to keep her warm and provide what comfort I could, the cold was taking its toll on her fragile body. She was growing weaker, her breaths shallow and labored. The thought of losing her was a heavy burden, one that weighed on my every waking moment. The remaining survivors were becoming increasingly desperate. The dwindling food supplies were a constant source of anxiety, and the fear of what might come next was palpable. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, the sense of impending doom growing with each passing hour. It was on the 7th day that the first signs of cannibalism began to appear. The hunger and desperation had driven the survivors to the edge, and the unthinkable became a chilling reality. The change was subtle at first, whispers and furtive glances, a growing sense of unease. I noticed it one evening when I found a group of survivors gathered in a corner, their voices hushed and their faces drawn with fear. The conversation was low, but the words were unmistakable. They were talking about food, about what we might be able to use to stave off hunger. At first, I tried to ignore it, hoping that it was just the result of stress and fear. But as the days went on, the whispers became more frequent, and the desperation in their voices was unmistakable. The fear was replaced by something darker, something I didn't want to acknowledge. The situation reached a breaking point when one of the survivors, a man who had been injured in the crash, was found dead. The cause of death was clear: starvation and exposure. But the body was disturbingly mutilated, the signs of cannibalism unmistakable. The discovery was a horrifying revelation. The sight of the mutilated body was a brutal reminder of how far we had fallen, how dire our situation had become. The fear and disgust were overwhelming, and I struggled to maintain control as the reality of what had happened sank in. I tried to talk to Eliza, to reassure her that we would find a way out of this nightmare. But the fear in her eyes was palpable, and her strength was waning. The thought of what was happening among the survivors was a constant source of dread, and I knew that we had to take action. I confronted the others, trying to understand what had driven them to such a horrifying decision. The desperation in their eyes was clear, and the fear of starvation had pushed them to the edge. They spoke of the need to survive, of the lengths they were willing to go to in order to stay alive. The conversation was tense and fraught with anger. The survivors were divided, some arguing for the need to find alternative solutions, while others were resigned to the grim reality of their situation. The fear of becoming the next victim was a constant, looming threat, and the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with a palpable sense of unease. I tried to remain calm, to offer a rational perspective amidst the chaos. But the fear was overwhelming, and the sense of impending doom was inescapable. The cabin had become a place of dread, where the lines between survival and morality were increasingly blurred. As the days went on, the fear of what might happen next grew more intense. The survivors were divided, and the sense of desperation was palpable. The cold was relentless, and the hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. I kept a close watch on Eliza, doing my best to keep her safe from the growing madness around us. But the fear of what might happen next was a constant, looming presence. The cabin had become a place of darkness and despair, a stark reminder of how fragile our situation was. In the midst of the growing tension, the realization that we were on the brink of losing our humanity was a chilling thought. The hunger and desperation had pushed us to the edge, and the lines between survival and morality had become dangerously blurred. The thought of what might come next was a constant source of dread. The fear of becoming the next victim, of being caught in the madness that had taken hold, was a relentless, unshakable presence. The cabin had become a place of darkness and despair, and the struggle for survival had taken on a new, more sinister edge. Part 8. Cannibalism and Hunting. The cabin, once a symbol of temporary refuge, had transformed into a crucible of horror. The cold was unrelenting, but it was the growing sense of dread and the darkening atmosphere within that were the most unbearable. The hunger had driven some of the survivors to a point where survival took precedence over everything else, even humanity. I awoke one morning to a chilling silence. The cabin was unusually quiet, and the usual sounds of shuffling and murmured conversations were absent. My heart pounded as I pushed myself up, the cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. I noticed that the survivors who had been lying motionless for days were now absent, their places marked only by empty spaces and scattered blankets. Eliza was curled up in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched a tattered blanket around her, her face ashen and hollow. I could see the worry etched in her features as she glanced towards the door, a silent plea for some semblance of safety. I ventured outside, the storm still raging, though it had lessened in intensity. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was relentless, a biting force that cut through the layers of clothing I had on. The landscape was a ghostly expanse of white, the only signs of life the distorted tracks left by the survivors as they moved about. The cabin's exterior had become a morose testament to our grim reality. Scattered around the area were remnants of what used to be the plane's wreckage, now half buried under snow. It was then that I noticed the tracks leading away from the cabin. Deep, irregular impressions in the snow, evidence of a hurried departure. With a growing sense of dread, I followed the tracks, each step a struggle through the deep snow. The cold was numbing, but the urgency in my chest pushed me forward. The tracks led me to a small, hidden alcove in the trees, partially concealed by heavy snow-covered branches. In the dim light, I could make out a scene that froze my blood. The survivors who had ventured out earlier were now huddled around a makeshift campfire. The sight was both surreal and horrifying. The fire was a feeble source of warmth, but it was the grim spectacle around it that was the true horror. The group was eating something with a disturbing, almost frenetic urgency. The sight was grotesque. The remains of a body, clearly human, were being torn apart and devoured. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The survivors had resorted to cannibalism, the hunger and desperation pushing them to the unthinkable. I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the horror of what I had witnessed. The primal urge to survive had driven them to this horrifying act, and the fear of what would come next was suffocating. I made my way back to the cabin, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and revulsion. Eliza was waiting anxiously, her eyes searching mine for answers. I took a deep breath, struggling to maintain control as I relayed the grim news. They've gone mad, I said, my voice trembling. They're eating each other. Eliza's face went ashen, the fear in her eyes reflecting the depth of the horror I had witnessed. The realization of what had happened was almost too much to bear. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, and the thin veneer of civilization had shattered. The cabin's atmosphere was now fraught with tension. The survivors who had remained inside were growing increasingly paranoid, their fear and desperation manifesting in frantic, fearful glances. The threat of violence loomed over us, the lines between sanity and madness growing dangerously thin. We had to find a way to escape. The growing madness among the survivors and the knowledge that they were now hunting for food, and perhaps for us, created an urgent need to act. We had to leave the cabin, to try and find a way out of this frozen hell before it was too late. Eliza and I gathered what little we had left, some supplies, a few makeshift weapons, and the remnants of our dwindling food supply. We prepared to leave, the weight of our grim reality pressing heavily on our shoulders. As we stepped outside into the relentless storm, the wind howled around us, the snow creating a blinding whiteout. The world was a frozen wasteland, and every step was a battle against the elements. The sense of impending doom was almost palpable, the knowledge that we were being hunted adding a layer of terror to our already desperate situation. The storm seemed to grow more intense, the wind whipping the snow into a frenzy. We moved cautiously, our progress slow and labored. The cold was a constant numbing presence, and the fear of what might happen next was a relentless gnawing sensation. As we navigated the treacherous terrain, I could feel the weight of our situation pressing down on us. The survivors had lost their humanity, and the knowledge that we were at the mercy of their desperation was a chilling thought. We had to keep moving, to stay ahead of the madness that had taken hold of them. Every rustle of the wind, every distant sound, was a source of dread. We were navigating through a landscape that had become a frozen trap, our only hope of survival lying in our ability to stay ahead of the horrors that had taken hold. The fear of being caught was a constant presence, the cold and the storm a constant reminder of how precarious our situation was. Part 9. Escape to the mountains. The wind howled with a relentless fury, its icy fingers gripping us as we trudged through the snow. The storm had become a furious tempest, the snow swirling around us in blinding gusts. Each step was a struggle, the snow deep and treacherous, pulling us down with every movement. The landscape was a frozen wasteland, a white expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Eliza stumbled beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her face was flushed with exertion, but her eyes betrayed a deep-seated fear that mirrored my own. The cold was unforgiving, seeping through our clothes and numbing our extremities. We had to keep moving, but the harsh conditions made every step a battle. Our escape from the cabin was fraught with peril. The survivors who had turned to cannibalism were a constant threat, their desperation making them unpredictable and dangerous. We had to stay ahead of them, to find a way out of this frozen hell before it was too late. The storm was a constant, howling presence, its intensity growing with each passing hour. The wind whipped the snow into a frenzied blur, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We moved cautiously, our progress slow and deliberate, trying to stay on what we hoped was a viable path through the mountains. The snow was relentless, piling up in deep drifts that made progress difficult. We had to stop frequently to catch our breath and to reassess our situation. The fear of being pursued was a constant, gnawing presence, the knowledge that we were not alone in this treacherous landscape adding to our sense of urgency. As the hours wore on, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind continued to howl, and the snow fell in thick, opaque sheets. We were moving through a world that had become an endless, frozen void. The cold was unbearable, and the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll on both of us. In the midst of our struggle, we stumbled upon a narrow, rocky crevice in the mountainside. It offered some protection from the storm, and we took advantage of the temporary respite. The wind was less intense here, though the cold was still biting. We huddled together, trying to conserve what little warmth we had. As we rested, I scanned the area, trying to determine our next move. The crevice was small and cramped, but it provided a brief escape from the storm. The thought of continuing our journey was daunting, but the need to find safety and avoid the cannibals drove us forward. After a brief rest, we resumed our trek through the mountains. The storm had become even more intense, the wind howling with a deafening roar. We were navigating through a landscape that seemed to shift and change with each gust of wind, the snow blurring our vision and making it difficult to maintain our bearings. The harsh conditions were taking their toll. Eliza was struggling, her movements growing slower and more labored. I tried to offer what support I could, but the cold was relentless, and our supplies were dwindling. The fear of collapse, of succumbing to the elements, was a constant worry. As we pressed on, we came across a series of treacherous slopes and rocky outcroppings. The terrain was difficult, the snow-covered rocks slick and unstable. Each step was a careful negotiation, the risk of falling a constant threat. We moved with caution, the fear of injury adding to the tension. In the midst of this harsh terrain, I noticed a faint glimmer of hope, a distant light flickering through the storm. It was a small, almost imperceptible glow, but it was enough to spark a flicker of hope in the otherwise bleak landscape. I pointed it out to Eliza, her eyes widening with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. With renewed determination, we made our way towards the light. The storm was relentless, but the prospect of safety spurred us on. The light grew brighter as we approached, and we could make out the outline of a small structure nestled in a sheltered area of the mountainside. As we drew closer, the structure took shape, a small cabin, its walls partially obscured by the snow. The sight of it was both a relief and a source of trepidation. We had to be cautious. The light might be a trap, a lure set by the cannibals, or it might be a genuine sign of safety. We approached the cabin cautiously, the storm still howling around us. The door was slightly ajar, and the interior was dimly lit by a flickering lantern. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief, but we had to remain vigilant. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but functional. There was a small fireplace, a few rudimentary supplies, and a small bed. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for some time, but it offered a temporary refuge from the storm. We set about making the cabin as comfortable as possible, using what supplies we had to start a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was a welcome relief, though the fear of what might happen next lingered in the back of our minds. As the fire crackled to life, we settled down to rest, our exhaustion overwhelming. The storm continued to rage outside, but for now, we had found a temporary sanctuary. The sense of safety was fleeting, but it was a small beacon of hope in the midst of our ordeal. The thought of the cannibals and the danger they posed was a constant worry. We had to remain alert, to be prepared for whatever might come next. The storm was relentless, and our situation was far from secure. But for now, we had found a temporary respite, and that was something to hold on to as we faced the challenges ahead. Part 10. The Final Battle and Resolution. The cabin offered a temporary respite from the relentless storm, but it was clear that our situation remained precarious. The storm's fury outside was unrelenting, and the chill of the mountainside seemed to seep into every crevice. We were safe for the moment, but the gnawing anxiety of what might happen next never fully left us. Eliza and I took stock of our situation. The cabin, though small and sparsely furnished, provided shelter from the worst of the elements. We had managed to get a fire going in the small fireplace, and its warmth was a welcome relief after the bone-chilling cold outside. The few supplies we found in the cabin, some canned goods, a few blankets, and a small amount of firewood, were meager but valuable. Despite our temporary safety, the fear of the cannibals, those who had descended into madness, loomed over us like a dark cloud. We had to stay alert, knowing that our sanctuary might be compromised at any moment. The knowledge that the survivors we had left behind could be hunting us made every sound outside a potential threat. We spent the night huddled together by the fire, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the cabin walls. Sleep was fitful, and the constant howling of the wind was a harsh reminder of the danger that still lurked outside. The isolation of our situation was palpable, and the fear of the unknown was a constant, oppressive presence. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart raced as I leapt from the bed, grabbing the makeshift weapon we had fashioned from a broken chair leg. Eliza was beside me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. The sound had come from outside, and the fear that the cannibals had found us was a crushing weight. I cautiously approached the door, the fear of what might be waiting for us intensifying with each step. As I peered outside, I saw a figure moving through the storm, a lone, shadowy figure struggling against the wind and snow. The sight was both alarming and confusing. The storm made it difficult to discern any details, but the presence of someone out there was a disturbing development. The figure drew closer, and I could make out a face, twisted in a mixture of desperation and madness. It was one of the survivors, a gaunt and hollow-eyed man who had been part of the group that had descended into cannibalism. His appearance was a grim reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. He was moving with a feverish urgency, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. As he approached the cabin, his movements became more erratic, and he began banging on the door with a frantic intensity. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable as he called out, his words barely audible over the howling wind. "Let me in! Please, let me in!" he cried, his voice a haunting mix of fear and hunger. "I need to get inside. I can't stay out here." I hesitated, torn between the need to protect ourselves and the faint glimmer of compassion for someone who had clearly been driven to the brink of madness. The choice was agonizing. If we let him in, we risked compromising our safety. If we refused, we faced the moral implications of abandoning someone in their time of need. Eliza looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The fear in her eyes mirrored my own, and the weight of the decision was almost too much to bear. I took a deep breath and made my decision. We couldn't turn him away. The storm and the cold were too harsh, and the moral weight of leaving him outside was too great. I opened the door just enough to let him in, the wind howling as it swept into the cabin. The man stumbled inside, his face a mask of relief and exhaustion. His clothes were tattered and his eyes were wild with a mix of fear and desperation. As he collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps, I could see the toll the ordeal had taken on him. The hunger and cold had left him gaunt and weak. We offered him what little food we had, and he accepted it with a fervent desperation. His eyes darted around the cabin, and he mumbled incoherently about the others, about how they had turned on each other, how the hunger had driven them to madness. The fear in his eyes was a stark reminder of the horrors we had narrowly escaped. As the hours passed, it became clear that the storm was not letting up. The wind continued to howl, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. We were trapped in the cabin with our unexpected guest, the knowledge that the cannibals were still out there a constant, looming threat. Night fell once more, and the storm outside grew more intense. The sound of the wind was a constant, howling presence, and the cold was a relentless, biting force. We took turns keeping watch, the fear of what might come next a constant, oppressive presence. It was during one of these watches that I heard a faint sound outside, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. The sound was unmistakable, the growl of something, or someone, moving in the snow. The realization that we might be facing a direct threat was terrifying. I roused Eliza and the man, and we prepared ourselves for what might come. The fear was palpable, and the tension was almost unbearable. We huddled together, weapons ready, and waited for the storm to reveal its secrets. The growl grew closer, the sound a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the cabin's walls. As the growling noise reached a crescendo, the door burst open with a violent force. The storm had driven the figure inside, and we were confronted with a horrifying sight. The figure was one of the cannibals, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of hunger and rage. The battle for survival had reached its final, brutal climax. The fight was intense and chaotic. The cabin became a battlefield, the small space filled with the sounds of struggle and desperation. The cannibal was relentless, driven by a primal need to survive. We fought with every ounce of strength we had, the stakes higher than ever. In the end, we managed to subdue the cannibal, the battle leaving us battered and exhausted. The cabin fell silent, the storm outside a constant, howling presence. The fear of what might come next was a constant reminder of the fragility of our situation. We'd survived the night, but the challenges were far from over. The storm continued to rage outside, and the threat of further attacks was ever present. Our fight for survival was not yet over, and the knowledge of the dangers that lay ahead was a constant, oppressive presence. As the dawn broke, the storm showed signs of abating. The wind had lessened, and the snow was beginning to settle. The cabin, though battered and scarred, had provided us with a temporary refuge. But the journey was far from over, and the struggle for survival continued. With the storm easing, we prepared to leave the cabin, the hope of finding safety driving us forward. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges we faced were formidable. But the determination to survive, to find a way out of this frozen nightmare, was a beacon of hope in the midst of our struggle. So, my friends, that's the end of the story. You can go to my playlist and see many more interesting, scary stories.